of the few good things about the pandemic, right? That we have more time to discuss things with people that we would otherwise not see so often. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the second roundtable and to three speakers. Before we continue, I just want to let you know that we are recording the session because we know there are people who would like to follow but who cannot. Will be put in our YouTube channel. Please let me know if that's okay for everyone, I hope. I wanted to introduce you, and I know they are already with us. I don't know, Jorge, if you need to make them moderators for them to speak, or three speakers. Those are Carolina Plaza Colodro from the Universidad de Salamanca. Hi, Carolina. Carolina is a postdoctoral researcher in the department of, in the area of political science of the University of Salamanca. And she's the specialist of challenger parties and populism in the European Union. Welcome, Carolina.
Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Hans-Jörg Trenz. I saw Hans-Jörg coming into our talks. Hans-Jörg is a professor at the University of Copenhagen. Hans-Jörg is the person who started discussing between communication and politics this notion of the European public sphere. Thanks a lot for being with us today, Hans-Jörg. Hans-Jörg is also a member of the scientific committee of OpenEUdebate, and he is going to discuss this notion of how the European public sphere is being affected by this crisis, and specifically how media are addressing them. And the third speaker is Alexandra Soika, who is playing at home, to say it this way. Alexandra is visiting professor at the Universidad Carlos III. She's a specialist of European public opinion, and she works especially also on populist parties, but also European identity. So I asked all the three speakers to address the topic of the roundtable from the room point of view. I know that for quantitative political scientists and some of our guests are quantitative political scientists, discussing an issue like public opinion without sufficient data, and I think we probably don't have the data yet, sounds a bit speculative. So I know that's speculative, but just to give you a bit of background of why we decided to tackle this issue, discussing with the students of EUCOPOL, we were using this notion of a focusing event, and to what extent there could be focusing events in the European Union, because I was telling them that I always thought the EU would never see a focusing event. Everything is very complex, everything is nationalized, and I thought it would almost be impossible, but to me it looks like this COVID crisis is a bit of that. So that would be the first question, or the thing I would like you to invite you to discuss, and then we'll see. I'm sure there will be many other issues to address. So I don't think we discussed the order of interventions before, but if you want, we can go in the order I introduced you. Is that okay, Carolina? Do you want to go first? What do you expect?
Perfect.
Looking at that from populist parties.
Okay. First, I would like thanks to you, Luis, Professor Bouza, and also EUCOPOL and OpenEUdebate for inviting me at such interesting and appealing roundtable. Also, the question posed to me is quite challenging and not straightforward at all. To begin, because the coronavirus may be a once-in-a-century event, and thus we are facing a crisis that is different from previous crises. The crisis of 2020 does not appear anything like the financial crisis of 2007-8, and not only because it threatens to bring a greater level of impoverishment, also, and this is so important in politics, because then there were human villains, bankers who broke the financial system, or Northern Europeans who let Southern Europe collapse. And now there is just an invisible infectious agent that wants only to replicate itself. Moreover, this crisis occurs in a dark political climate, as over the past decade, the world has grown more authoritarian, nationalistic, xenophobic, unilateralist, anti-establishment, and also anti-expertise. Therefore, we can assure that the current state of politics and also geopolitics has exacerbated and not stabilized the crisis. Second, it's worthy to bring into consideration the fact that that Europeanism has been weakened by other crises of the past decade. Its crisis has reduced trust between member states and within the world system, and this is the real problem nowadays in the European Union, in my opinion. Every time the European Union has strengthened its hand in response to a crisis, whether centralized refugee policy or oversight of national budgets, there has been resistance and also resentment, let's say. This time is not different at all. The current crisis, although some European leaders have warned against giving in to such coronavirus nationalism, the pandemic is pulling at divisions within the European Union. While European leaders have converged on our response to the public health crisis, more or less at least, countries remain divided over how to help the economy. In this regard, the pandemic has reopened the bones of the Eurozone crisis, resurrecting stereotypes about Southern Europeans and Northerners that I'm not going to reproduce, as we all know them. And in the European countries, there are Eurosceptics waiting to exploit these divisions, and if they conclude that there are political gains to be made from taking things into the national arena, they will. Meanwhile, the faith in the European Union as a project has diminished. Because many citizens will pay a huge price because of coronavirus, and public opinion in some member states will not easily forget any further austerity or lack of help. That means that the real human cause of the pandemic, combined with popular anxieties and a sense, justified or not, that European institutions are not helping, can easily add to a potent centrifugal force. For instance, when the Italian government first activated the EU solidarity mechanism, not one country came to its aid. Well, it's not surprising then that a recent poll shows that 67% of Italians believe being an EU member is a disadvantage for Italy, up from 47% in November 2018. Then this process is leading to rising Euroscepticism, but not only, because it goes hand in hand with the rise of nationalism too. Well, it fuels all the nationalists, and among other things, because until the date, it could seem that some of the actions undertaken will play straight into the hands of the populist right, closing borders and putting one's own nation first. This paves the way for the coronavirus to become a tool in Europe's political battle over migration, for instance. In Italy, Salvini, the leader of the far-right Lega, used the COVID-19 to advance his xenophobia. And he circulated a video of a migrant ship arriving in Italy and falsely implying that migrants were responsible for the outbreak. Along with other European far-right leaders, Salvini also used Europe's border closures as another opportunity to vilify the European Union and its commitment to the free movement of people. Far-right politicians in France, Germany, Italy, also in Spain, have already demanded that the governments introduce strict border controls. Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen, has also criticized the religion of the borderlessness of the leaders of the European Union, arguing that a border protects populations, whatever the situation. Also, the Alternative for Germany leader in the Bundestag, Alice Weidel, has blamed the spread of the virus on what she called the dogma of the open borders. The epidemic has bolstered the cause of of those who have long opposed refugees, most of them the same parties and politicians who advocate for strict border controls. Then we can imagine that, easily imagine that trends emerging in European democracies suggest that future will likely take on more nationalist characteristics. But well, what about populism? This anti-elite and people-centered think ideology. Plenty of observers have rushed to predict that the COVID-19 pandemic will seriously harm the political fortunes of populism, or even make populism the outbreak fears ideological casualty. Populists, they assert, vilify experts. Now we are all learning that the price of not listening to experts may well be our own lives. Populists, it is also often said, are the great simplifiers, but now we need experienced bureaucrats and leaders who can deal with a complex challenge. Populist fortunes also depends on mainstream parties, and they also assure that the pandemic is also renewing faith in mainstream political parties and experts. Less obviously, but it will matter whether the left, which in theory could benefit from a new emphasis on state capacities, can find an institutional form to mobilize citizens. Moreover, according to some research, anxiety makes people more risk-averse and therefore more likely to choose the status quo. Yet, in my opinion, these are the early days of a long crisis, and it's premature to entirely talk of the possibility of the version of populism. The very real suffering caused by the pandemic, rather than inspiring a structural reform, might become part of the narrative circulating in a right-wing culture of grievance, carefully tended by populists who make majorities feel like minorities under siege. More importantly, populists can still deploy the key strategy of dividing citizens against each other and blaming minorities for all sorts of problems. Even if the actual enemy is invisible, the lived experience of vulnerability might still be incorporated into the populist playbook. In addition, the populists will benefit from economic challenges that the pandemic will leave behind. And research show that crisis-driven unemployment and economic insecurity are correlated with populist voting. Likewise, inequality is likely to grow. The pandemic affects harder to low-income workers, for example, aggravating divisions that populists can still exploit. Populism then could flourish as the coronavirus spreads. Whether it does so, in my opinion, will depend largely on the kind of language politicians and the media use to discuss the virus. It will also depend on how national governments and the European Union perform in their practical management of the crisis, and whether citizens consider the statements on the situation to be credible. As such, to contain the national populist wave that seems to be coming, the European Union should focus on to be living up to its ideals, a union that shows solidarity between peoples and nations. It's true that the European Union is internally ill-equipped to deal with any crisis or unforeseen circumstances, but need to improvise a way out of current divisions, because this may be, and we can discuss it later, a make it or break it moment for the European project. And that is, aside from public health, what, in my opinion, is at stake at this moment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cara. You were mentioning Salvini, but and maybe that's something that can also help to introduce Hans-Jörg. But one of the funny things is that one of the contradictions of this crisis is that Salvini has been in a difficult position trying to find a common ground to justify his position with Austrian, Finnish, Dutch colleagues, because he understands that Corona bonds were very popular in Italy, right? So he had to do lot of political and discursive contortion to justify the position. On the divisions, I think that's a very important point that we probably want to come back later on, right? To what extent, because we say probably this crisis is going to bring, to make the state sexy again, but on the other hand, if the state or if state protection fails a number of workers, if the state fails to protect those who are more affected by the crisis, could this not, on the other hand, rather fuel a discourse that, well, if the state does not protect me, it should not protect anyone. We need a smaller state anywhere. So that's probably something that is, I agree with you, that we're going to see deepening divisions on this point, and maybe some of them we don't see them coming yet. Now, and thanks a lot also, Caro, for sticking so well to the time. Hans-Jörg, the floor or the screen is yours. Thanks for joining us from Copenhagen.
Thanks, buenas tardes. I'm actually talking to you from Berlin, not from Copenhagen, which is a much more enjoyable place to stay during this lockout, I must say. And I'm not exactly sure what you want to know from me now, but I will give it a try and talk a little bit about the public sphere and the role of the media and journalism in such a crisis. And you just said in your remark that the crisis makes states and executives sexy again. And I think the same also holds for journalism and for the media, that they play a very prominent role in the crisis. And the panel debate here is about public opinion. One thing is to study public opinion through surveys, but then it is also important to understand what actually informs public opinion during a pandemic, and what kind of public sphere then is constituted by the pandemic. And you also talk about the COVID as a focusing event, and it focuses attention, of course. It bundles debates. And this is a constitutive moment for a public sphere. But then at the same time, this is a strange kind of public sphere, because there's only one single topic that is debated, and overall this is debated. And the news you get are very negative. So there's an overall negativity in the kind of information that you get. And information, of course, becomes crucial. It's a question of survival. To get the right information, if there's a health crisis, you confront risks, you confront uncertainty, and you will need to get knowledge. And for states and for executives, this means that they need to spread knowledge about the risks. So people need to be made aware. And without raising awareness and knowledge, there is actually no way to overcome the pandemic. So this is indeed a crucial element. So informed public opinion then is kind of part of the cure. And governments and public health authorities who wish to fight the pandemic then need also to invest in public and media communication. So you need what you need is a well-functioning public communication strategy. So when we talk here about the responsibility of the media and of journalism also to focus then the attention of the public and to make sure that people get the right information. It's not an easy task. In fact, media in a public health crisis face several challenges, and there are three possibilities, I would say. The first is that media might become dysfunctional in such a situation, or they might become dysfunctional also as the crisis unfolds. Then the second possibility is that newsreaders, the audiences, might not be open to receive factual information. They might prefer to ignore information. So nobody can be forced to become knowledgeable, and people might shy away even from information and the news. And the third is that knowledge and information is not easily available. There's a huge uncertainty. And the coronavirus is also poorly understood by the experts themselves. There's no commonly agreed opinion also. The experts disagree more than they agree. And so choices that are taken then remain contested. And as a result of this then, also trust in established media and in experts might go down as the crisis unfolds. So the three scenarios then, how does science and factual knowledge inform public opinion making? The first scenario would be that people remain largely uninformed. They get no or they only get very insufficient information. The second possibility would be that people are well informed, or that they are at least better informed than in normal times. So they are supplied with good information quality. And the third possibility is that people are misinformed. So they receive information that is not relevant, or that is even fake. So they might even read news, but they get the wrong ones. They're exposed to fake news. And we can check now quickly which of these three scenarios is the most likely. The first two, people remain largely uninformed during the pandemic. I would say that this is the most unlikely scenario, simply because people actively engage in seeking information. They also want to escape from privacy, and they are online all the time, which means also that they're exposed to news and to information. You can see this how social media traffic, how internet traffic has increased during the weeks of Corona. And people not only seek entertainment online, they also actively seek information. So many of us become kind of news junkies in such a situation. So the first scenario, that people are not informed at all, I think can be dismissed. But are they well informed or better informed? And this is a little bit more difficult to establish. It can certainly not be measured directly, but I think there is some evidence that journalism during the pandemic is actually functioning quite well, and also that audiences seek quality information. So I had access to first surveys that were conducted, comparative surveys that investigated the type of news sources that are accessed by newsreaders in the Western world, and it shows that they actively seek for quality information. For instance, here in Europe, the information that is distributed by public broadcasters has gained in prominence. So the pandemic, in a way, is an opportunity also for independent journalism, for quality journalism, to gain credibility, and this is appreciated by many news readers. There are also kind of curious ritual. There are quite curious rituals of how these news are read, how audiences relate to news. If you think, for instance, of these country rankings that we all follow in the news media, how mortality rates are compared across countries, and also how they are discussed then by social media users, or also in our private lives, how we try to understand the situation, for instance, in Spain, the situation in Italy. Why is it so much worse than what we experience here in Germany? And what is quite interesting, we relate this to the performance of government. So indirectly, we assess the legitimacy of government, taking as the criteria how they master the crisis. This is a quite interesting phenomenon. Lastly, I want to say something about this third scenario, that there is a risk to be exposed to fake news, that fake news become more prominent. And well, this is of course true that if there is enhanced information, there is also more misinformation that is growing. This is without doubt the case. But what is the impact of this? I would say that there is also a growing awareness of the risk of misinformation. You read about this all the time. Also, news readers are aware of these risks, and they change their news reading behavior accordingly. These surveys I was just quoting that show that there is a search for quality information also shows that these alternative news sources, where fake news are most likely to be encountered, are the least popular. Only a very small minority of people regularly checks these alternative news sources. So of course fake news are growing, and they remain a risk, but at the same time they become kind of marginalized, and there is also a growing awareness of precisely these risks, and maybe there is a chance of a growing media literacy as a result of the crisis. And lastly, to say also something about the populists. My impression is that the populists might indeed be the losers of this COVID-19 pandemic, and how it drives public sphere mobilization. The voice of the populists has lost credibility in most countries. It became marginalized, especially during the first weeks of the pandemic. But also here we need to be careful, because this might be quickly changing. So they might gaining momentum, and there are indeed some signs that precisely this is taking place in the last week, the last days even, that you find manifestations of what could be called a kind of anti-pandemic populism that is found in the street protests, for instance, here in Berlin, also in other towns of Germany. This is a spreading phenomenon. It's a very diffuse phenomenon also, that it's not organized, it's not centrally organized, but remains very diffuse, and we need probably to follow this up a little bit longer to be able to make sense of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hans-Jörg. I think that's very interesting scenarios. They also connect very well to what we were discussing with the previous speaker, with Nadia, and with what we did we'll discuss about the media. But I think that's an evolving scenario. The remark I would have, and maybe that's worth for the second round of discussion and for the Q&A later on. But if these scenarios probably will contribute to the renationalization of the pandemic discussion, right? Because we know that the media scenario are very different. So we may have a few countries where scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3 happen at the same time, depending on the type of media landscape, the relationship between politics and media, and so on. So that's also part of the argument to think that let's not go too far before interpreting this is going to be a sort of one, le grand soir, to say that in the expression of the French, for the European public sphere.
Okay.
And I see Alexandra, you have already connected your camera. Welcome, Alexandra. The floor is yours, Alexandra. I think there are a lot of interesting points already there. Don't feel obliged necessarily to respond to what has been said. I'm sure you want to address that from different perspectives. So the floor is yours, and I think you are all being very disciplined. So I'm glad we are going to have some time for the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Luis, and thanks so much for the invitation. And I must say it's very nice to see all these familiar faces and kind of get the sense that we're kind of having our normal academic exchange, exchange, even though everybody's connecting from their own houses. So yes, thanks so much also for Carol and Hans-Jörg for all these very interesting points. And I think, yes, I will address your question and the broader topic from a slightly different perspective. I want to focus on the role of identity, which is my focus of research. But first of all, of course, what you already said, Luis, is that, well, we don't have much data yet. So me being one of those quantitative political scientists, I must say that it's rather hard to kind of assess current state of European public opinion. However, I want to talk a bit about what was the state of public opinion before, just before the crisis hit, right? We have the most recent Eurobarometer studies from November 2019. I'm not sure if, I hope they managed to to do the March survey, and we will be able to see how these opinions and attitudes have changed. I hope that the coronavirus has not prevented the field work. So I want to disagree slightly with Karol, who had a slightly negative, more negative view of the state of European public opinion. And it is true that there has been a very negative effect of the economic and the financial crisis. Obviously, a lot of the attitudes, especially related towards the kind of specific outputs of the European Union, vary very much with these business cycles, with these economic cycles, and of course, the economic financial crisis has undermined support for European integration. However, when we look at recent data, when we look at data in longitudinal perspective over the last decade, you can definitely see that dip that the economic and financial crisis marks on European public opinion, and how it reduced support, it reduced trust, institutional trust. However, when you look at that data in 2019, you actually see that there has been a recovery in the levels of support for European integration, and quite significant ones, right? And you can see right now, for instance, compared to 10 years ago, 10 percentage point increase in the positive image of the European Union, right? So still, of course, we have a persistent ambiguity. We have 1/3 of the respondents. Of course, I'm talking about the EU average as a kind of neutral or not decided whether they view it positively or negatively. But exit skepticism also has not kind of changed or prevailed, and we only have about 1/3 of Europeans agreeing that their country would be better outside of the European Union. And of course, these overall percentages differ very much across national context, right? And I think this is a very important point to make here, is that anything that we might talk about in relation to the European public opinion is necessarily very broad generalizations, because then we have the different scenarios according to different national developments, economic but also political, as well as national frames, right? But I will come back to that in a second. But when we look at the kind of broad general picture of European public opinion, the picture is not so bleak, I would say. We have seen a recovery in the last decade after this kind of low point of economic and financial crisis. And most specifically, I wanted to mention data on European identification, because this is also something that has increased in the last decade. And I think that is even more interesting, because identification tends to be stable, tends to be something that is developed through socialization. They're not very, social identities are not very malleable. But we have seen in the last decade a rise in attachment to Europe as well as the European Union. About 1/3 of European public now says that they feel attached to the idea of Europe and the EU. And also this national focus of identity, so this exclusive national identification, devoid of any attachment and any recognition of identity as European, is also reducing, and it has reduced by 13 percentage points since 2010. So of course, it remains to be seen whether this is a more long-term trend or maybe just an accident. But I mean, I would argue that we definitely could see this as a more long-term trend, be it because of generational change and having this younger generation who have kind of been brought up with all the European benefits and the kind of normal state of things as being a member of the European Union, be it because of greater social interactions, or maybe because of greater salience of European institutions in the media, because of these several crises that we have seen during the last decade. And I think it's quite hard to still think that in a very national frame, when you hear about the economic crisis, you hear about the Eurozone crisis, you hear about the refugee and migrant crisis, and now we have the coronavirus crisis. So all of these events, I think, kind of convey this message that we are in this together, right? There is some kind of interdependence. Of course, there's also the global interdependence, but specifically in Europe, I think I would interpret this as kind of the citizens realizing that we are part of this broader region, if you want to say, or maybe a community. It remains to be seen. So this is how it looked like before the coronavirus hit Europe. Since then, we have seen a lot of talk about the supposed failure of the European Union in reacting to this crisis. I think that's very interesting to see how quickly these wounds from the previous crisis have been opened again, and this north-south division that Karol was referring to has re-emerged. However, I would say that I actually disagree with this negative interpretation, and I think, especially in comparison to the economic financial crisis, the reaction was surprisingly quick, and I think that the European institutions are doing a lot to help, or doing everything they can to help in this situation within their limits of their competences, right? And I think here it's very interesting that this kind of prevailing notion that, oh, Europe is failing us, or European solidarity is failing, I think speaks to the lack of knowledge in the public opinion about what the EU can do and what it can't do. And I think demanding a great role of the EU in response to the coronavirus crisis is basically the illustration of the fact that most people, and even probably some journalists maybe, and politicians sometimes prefer not to recognize the fact that there are these institutional limits in their response. So I think that's my second point. And of course, we are not only talking about the health crisis, we're not only talking about the coronavirus crisis, we're talking about the impending and economic crisis, right? This will be the real test, and we know from research on European public opinion that these economic cycles are very important for changing opinions about the European Union. So here, I would like to argue that yes, we know that these economic evaluations are important, but at the same time, if we are seeing greater rootedness of European identification in the identities of European citizens, that might actually compensate at least a bit a very negative reaction, as we are kind of realizing that we're in this together. But yes, this is definitely a make it or break it, another of those make it or break it moments for European integration, right? And we also have a democracy crisis, right? I mean, I think you already mentioned Hungary, Poland. We have a real democratic crisis in those countries, so there will be many issues that we need to address as a community. But overall, my argument would be that Europeanness or European identification has grown, and that might be something that can anchor the very strong or can provide some kind of resilience against a very strong backlash and a total disintegration of European Union. That being said, of course, and I already mentioned the role of knowledge and the fact that it's very low. I mean, really, this is, of course, it's a very complex system of governance and a very complex institutional setup, but knowledge about the EU is very low in the general population. Of course, not in this group, because you know a lot about this issue, but in general. And of course, we have this failure of public communication on part of the EU, but that is due to the limited resources. This is the main actors in the public sphere are the national political elites that have these very perverse incentives to blame anything that might go not as planned or that might be a problem, to blame it on Brussels, right? Without acknowledging their role in this system, because there is no Brussels, there is no Europe without the nation states and without the national institutions, right? So definitely there is an issue there, and I think to some extent I have been of course, as everybody here, following the news coverage of the crisis. I don't think that, I mean, it's impossible to avoid it, but I found it very interesting that we are seeing a lot of coverage of other European countries. We have seen the Macron interview in English talking about European solidarity. We see Merkel every day speaking in our news at 9 p.m. talking about the test for European integration. Conte gave an interview to Spanish El País talking about European solidarity, speaking to directly to the European audiences. We have seen von der Leyen in Spanish national news directing her speech directly to the Spanish citizens, saying that we are in this together, and then there will be this solidarity. Of course, we also have heard about the Dutch minister, right, who doesn't want to support any kind of debt mutualization. But I think it's very interesting to see, and to some extent, of course, this has also happened with the economic and financial crisis, and it has happened also with the migration crisis. But we are seeing, I think, especially in this situation, the greater protagonism of these European leaders, and I think this is exactly what Europe needs, right? We need leadership. We need strong leadership in the sense that European leadership, right? Not only thinking about the national gain, which has been very often the case, and even, I mean, in the coverage of European affairs, when you look at national newspapers, you very often see, even in Spain, right, the type of coverage that is Spain is a very Euro-optimist country, where we talk about, oh, how much money has been secured for Spain, or in the budget, or in any other element of the European policies. So a very kind of utilitarian and pragmatic approach, and there's really little of these grand European ideas. Okay, so I think, I mean, I can stop here. I had some points about migration attitudes, because I think both of you talked about it. I just wanted to say that we are seeing that actually these attitudes are improving. So, which might be also another interesting point. Also, consider the future of populism in Europe, and we are realizing that we need that. We need those migrants to help us run the European economy, right? So let's see what happens next, and I'm sure this is for sure this is a very, very interesting time to live, right? Interesting times. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I know several people want to discuss. Some of them have been sending me WhatsApps about different points. I think there are many things that are common in your address to what we had before. There's one thing which also speaks to what we were discussing just before this panel, which has to do with narratives, right? You were saying we have a whole generation that is being socialized about European politics through crisis, and who may be getting the message, we're in this together. We may not always solve things well. We may do things in a very peculiar way of discussing a permanent crisis, but in the end, you know what to expect, and what you expect. What you expect is a European deal, a European solution, something. But you keep kicking the ball to the future, and this means you're in Europe. And this is probably why, well, the EU has very little competence in the field of health, but still we expect the EU to do something, because this is what we have learned from the previous crisis. The EU had very little competencies in the field of migration. The EU member states could not bail each other and so on, and still we expected the European solution. So if you want, that's the positive message. But on the other hand, there's a lot of negativity, and this has been said by all of you. And this is also a way of opening up the discussion. And I know our colleague Carmen Sancho is also with us, and we have discussed narratives with the students. But if you look at, and I'm not only thinking about the EU, but also about the EU, it's very difficult to find, if you go to your Netflix catalog or to whatever platform you're watching in this day of lockdown, it's very difficult to find positive narratives about the future. There's no utopia anymore. It's very difficult to think about our technological future in positive terms, right? So even though we know we're in it together and probably we are going to survive, still it's very difficult to find a common narrative of what solidarity means and so on, right? So this is one of the things where we need imagination. And the link I would make is, at the time of disinformation, probably in the end, whether one side or the other has it, will a lot depend on the narrative, right? Not so much on to what extent do we get the data or to what extent do we get the messages across. All narratives have a measure of imagination. They all have a certain type of encroachment on reality. So this is probably what we also can expect in the future months and years. This increasingly contradictory narratives about what Europe means. I know you probably want to react to each other's comments, but we only have about 20 minutes for the discussion. So I think what we could do is get a few questions from the participants, and then in the you choose which ones to answer, and that will also be the occasion to react to what we heard before. So whoever wants to speak, if you look at the icons at the bottom of your screen, you can just raise your hand. So I'm going to give the floor first to Raquel, who was waiting to speak since the first session. Raquel, the floor is yours. And sorry, I forgot to mention, our three speakers are very fluent in Spanish. So if anyone is a bit shy about speaking in English, don't hesitate. You can raise your question in Spanish. Raquel first, and then Oscar. Yes,
Huh?
Raquel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon, and first of all, thank you for organizing this Event Final conference, because everything you've talked about was so interesting. And what I wanted to ask you is that from your professional view, how can we as global citizens make our own contribution to minimize or maybe stop the spreading of this pandemic's infodemic? Because as a journalism and media student, I just ask you for a few keys or some tips or a piece of advice to deal with the situation in which you are about to face some disinformative stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raquel. As I just collect three questions now, and this is the second person who raised his hand is Oscar. Oscar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you all for your time. My question maybe is a bit off topic, I hope not. And you all spoke at some point about populism and how that poses a danger that can come out of the COVID crisis. I was also thinking, I read not long ago a paper by, I think it was Ramiro and Lavezzolo, about stealth democracy and how this was an attempted thing after the 2008 crisis. I was wondering if this approach in terms of technocrats and and that this stealth democracy concept, is it possible that this grows again after the COVID crisis? Are there like any chances for this? And to what extent is this a danger as well to democracy, this approach, and as it might come out of the COVID crisis? And then one last thing is regarding this same thing. I think Alexandra talked about European leadership and how that might be a good thing for the EU after this COVID crisis. To what extent is it compatible to have these technocrats take over policy, one might say, and at the same time reinforce the European message? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Oscar. I think that's a very interesting question as well. And I don't know if Professor Ferrero is still with us. Ferrero was telling me through the chat that she had a provocative question. but I don't know if she wants to raise it or if she lost connection. I don't see her. Is there anyone who wants to raise a question for the speakers? Okay, maybe as you think then we can already address these the questions, and of course do take the chance if you want to react to each other's point. So should we go in the reverse order of the speeches? So maybe Alexandra, maybe you want to begin. That's okay, but we don't hear you.
Okay, no.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Luis. Did you say that you wanted me to start?
Yeah.
I thought I heard my name.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I would just very quickly reply to some very interesting questions. So about the question about disinformation, I would say, because you asked about what we can do, I mean, I would say that nowadays it's part of our citizens' obligation to kind of only share verified information and try to keep the conversation around or keep fake news and this misinformation from our feeds, right? I mean, I'm not an expert beyond that on these topics. I like the question about leadership versus technocracy. I think this is a very big dilemma for Europe, and as I said, I think we need European leadership, but at the same time, of course, national leaders very much prefer this technocratic Europe that has no face, because then they can exactly use it, as I was saying. They can either blame anything they wish on those faceless bureaucrats, or they can take the kind of benefits from whatever policies are working. But more broadly, I think, of course, all of this brings a lot of questions about democracy and about how the European Union will reconfigure itself. One thing I think is very interesting is to think about, and also that goes back to the debate or the question about populism, is what will be the reaction from the left. Some already anticipate that not only state will become sexy again, but maybe social democracy will become sexy again. And we could also think about left populism kind of rising from this crisis. In any case, for sure, there will be a lot of pressure to kind of address. And again, as Luis said, even though the European Union does not have a lot of competences or has been not able to develop this idea of social Europe, for instance, for sure that will come back. I just wanted to add one more point on positive narratives that Luis mentioned in the beginning. I think we already have some of those, but maybe we take them for granted and we don't appreciate them. I think one of those positive narratives is the freedom of movement. And again, going back to the perception of young people, I think young people, at least this is what my students tell me, they cannot imagine Europe without being able to travel freely, to study abroad, and without the common currency and without all these facilities. So I think the positive narrative, the potential for this positive narrative exists, right? As well as greater diversity, cultural diversity, tolerance, which has actually risen in European population with throughout the period of European integration. So I would be more, maybe I'm just the optimist in this panel, and I'm seeing everything with trying to see everything from a more positive point of view. But I think we already have it. Maybe we need to make it more visible, right? Or maybe it needs to be endangered for us to realize that was this positive narrative all along.
So, Sandra, maybe Hans-Jörg, you want to react to any of these points on the infodemic or the technocrats versus democracies?
Yes, I would like to respond quickly to this very interesting question about what can be done to prevent the infodemic. And to understand this, we first of all need to understand the extent to which there is such an infodemic. And here I think it is important to emphasize that an infodemic is almost an intrinsic element of any pandemic, and there is a historical lesson to be learned from this. As soon as there is a plague, there are also fake news in response to the plague. So in a way, this seems to be a kind of almost a cultural pattern in the way people react to a public health crisis, or to a crisis actually in general. You can also say that this is an intrinsic element of crisis discourse, that whenever there is a crisis, there is enhanced uncertainty, and enhanced uncertainty is a condition where fake news, where misinformation can very easily spread. So to avoid it altogether is kind of impossible, because it is already an element of the crisis. It is something that defines the crisis, actually. And still, of course, there is something that can be done. And you can call for responsibility. You can call for government control, and you can also call for control of the media. All this, of course, comes at a price. The price is freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So we must also be aware of this. And the common assumption is that citizens and also news readers, that they need to get some external support to become kind of resilient against fake news. For instance, that you enhance media education in schooling, the media literacy should be kind of an element of any school curriculum, or that you enhance moderation on social media, and or that you flag fake news, as this is done, for instance, by Twitter. I just read today that Twitter will invest even more resources in flagging fake news that are shared through their platform. All these are important steps. But I think we should also not forget the media users, the news readers, and the citizens. What can they do? And I think your question actually pointed to precisely this element. And here I would say that we need to enhance critical capacities. It's a question of being critical, learning also to be critical, to be a critical news reader, not simply a consumer of fake news. And one of the main value actually of fake news is that they entertain. So fake news have an entertainment value. It is not so much that people who consume fake news necessarily believe what they read, but they are entertained. They might even decide to share them simply to share something that they consider to be funny, not something that they necessarily believe is true. And what we can do is to enhance a critical news reading, and this also relates to modes of empowerment of news readers to handle this kind of distorted information in a competent manner. This is a responsibility for our education system, but it is also our personal responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jörg. I see Professor Ferrero has raised her hand. I'm going to give the floor first to Carolina Plaza, and then we can collect roots and whichever more questions we have, because we still have 8 minutes. So Carolina, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm gonna try to be so brief to get the other questions. First, I would like to apologize for seeming so negative. I wouldn't mean that nationalism, populism is gonna win the narrative battle, but it's an opportunity. It's a window of opportunity for these kind of actors, and they are going to try to build and construct a new kind of discourse to get votes. That's my only point in this regard. The economy is going to change the day-to-day life of people is gonna to change hugely. Then I think they are going to think in utilitarian terms more than in other terms now. in regard to Europe, because people so affected by the coronavirus crisis are expecting an European solution for sure. And well, I also think it's not a close even. It's still an evolving phenomena that can have different solutions at the end. But yeah, narratives and the role of media are going to be crucial for the result of this kind of crisis. Well, what can we do as citizens? Well, I totally agree with Alexandra. We need to be responsible, and it's one of our duties as citizens living in a democracy to share and to be informed with quality news and quality information. But this is also we need responsible media to have it. I'm not that sure that media and the media industry is going to be so responsible and so aware that the role they have in democracies or quality democracies nowadays. And this is also connected with Oscar's question about the self-democracy and if populism is a danger for democracy. This is a huge question, and I think I'm not prepared to answer right now, but for sure, in my opinion, the coronavirus crisis is shaping democracy in a lot of ways. First of all, we as citizens are going to change our role within democracies. Maybe we are going to vote digitally in the next couple of years. I don't know. I'm sure that this crisis is going to change democracy as we know it, and that's it.
Thank you very much, Carolina. We have 5 minutes for one or two more questions. Ruth told me she has some connection problems. I hope now she can hear us. I don't know if she's still with us. Ruth, would you like to take the floor? Otherwise,
okay.
Jorge.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, Ruth.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was having some problems back home. I have a question for the three speakers, and it has to do with the discourse and the security language. How do you think the populist forces will be can be combated from center left and center right parties or political forces if they are buying basically the radical discourse that these right-wing and populist political forces are using? I mean, we are seeing everywhere how all political classes using these militarized discourses. We can hear it in France, we can hear it in Hungary, we can hear it here in Spain as well, everywhere. So there is a war language, and that means that Europe started at some point to securitize the idea of Europe, and now with this pandemic may probably go farther up. And I am curious, what is your position on this issue? If do you think that this war language and securitization approach will be deeper in the near future? One of the speakers mentioned about the importance of education media in the curricula at the schools, as it is doing it in Sweden, for instance. Do you think that I have some doubts on that, because if we are speaking all the time about information, about politics in ways of this war language, we are probably will forget about rights and freedoms, and we'll might sacrifice those freedoms and rights for the security perception. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferrero. And this is Dr. Diaz-Lanchas. Hello, Jorge. Do you want to take the floor?
Hello. So can you hear me well?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
So, well, my question is, well, it's a general question for the three members in the panel. So, in my case, I'm an economist. So I'm a bit worried of the political or the economical roots of this content towards the EU. So now, given all this health crisis, once it's been solved, I could expect, or well, in general, main analysts are considering that after the health crisis, there will be a debt crisis, potentially in Europe for many years. So let's hope not as hard as in this current decade, but potentially there could be a debt crisis. So this means that economies will be at some point facing fiscal discipline measures, or just in general austerity measures. No. So my question, given this potential scenario, is what could be the consequences not only on the populism but on the discontent, no, towards the European Union project, not only towards the institutions but in general, no. So what could be the potential consequences of all this, no? Because to me this is the main concern, at least on a personal basis.
Thank you very much, Jorge. We have two very difficult questions at the very end. I would say let's try to address one of them in 1 minute, 1 minute and a half each, if you can. And I know that's very difficult. Who wants to give it a try?
Well, I can begin if you want.
Yes.
I'm gonna be so brief. Regarding the first question, I think that this is not a new phenomenon because mainstream parties are adopting the main discourse or issues exploited by radical parties. The war or security language and narratives maybe in mainstream parties' strategies are useful, and they have no problem to adopt them. But I think it's not a new phenomenon, and mainstream parties are more and more radicalized, let's see, in the issues, sometimes also in the positions they adopt regarding these potentially radical issues. And for the second one, I'm so worried about the future of the European Union and what will mean these actions, governmental actions at the European level, regarding the bailouts or the budget intervention. I don't know. I think we have to focus on the process that will follow in the next couple of years. It's going to be more intergovernmentalism. It's going to expand the European sphere to make decisions for all of us. I'm so worried too about the consequence of new fiscal constraints in European populations. I'm not so sure.
Thanks a lot, Carolina. Alexandra, Hans-Jörg, do you want to add anything on these last two questions?
I can very briefly reply if you want.
Mm-hmm.
For the first question, I would say that I completely agree with Carol. This is not something new, but I would say that I have seen more of it with this particular crisis at the national level. I have not seen so much concern with secularization of Europe specifically, because we have closed borders and we're talking about preserving the national communities, no? But of course, this is something to definitely think about, because one thing that citizens want from the EU is greater security, right? So of course they want from the state, but they also expect it from the Union in terms of this its regional relevance. about the discontent and austerity. Thank you so much, Jorge, for bringing that up. We are actually working on a paper together on that topic, so we have had discussions about.
I'm glad you have this question.
So, you know, I think I might just say that I hope that the European leaders have learned on their mistakes from the economic and financial crisis, and at least some of these funds that are being made available to the member states will not be tied, will be transfers and not loans, and the kind of austerity constraints, at least until the situation allows for it, will not be so dramatic as it was with the last crisis. But of course, we are facing a huge economic recession. So yeah, I'm so worried as well, as Carol said. So thank you so much.
Well, I could conclude with the remark that I share all the concerns, which I certainly do, but let me also emphasize that it is very important to look here at country differences and to understand country differences. It is definitely the case that the South will be hit much harder by the looming debt crisis than the north of Europe. Germany has much more resources to survive this than any other country. And so this will also lead then to divisions within the Eurozone and within the European Union, which give rise to further concern. And these divisions are also important if we want to understand the effect of these militarized discourses. The first question. There is also a danger of authoritarianism, of growing authoritarianism, but in some countries and not in other countries. Mm-hmm. And lastly, it is also important to distinguish authoritarianism and populism. The problem here with populism is not so much that they are authoritarian, they are rather anti-authoritarian. And so there is a real danger of authoritarianism and secularization, but it's to be distinguished from populism. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jörg, Carolina, Alexandra. I think that's been a very interesting discussion. I think it's also the proof that one can have a very interesting discussion from home. It doesn't mean that we don't want to get out, but as I said at the beginning, maybe one of the positive effects of the pandemic is that we can have occasions to discuss more easily. So I don't want to take much more of anyone's time. I have supposedly 15 minutes for the close up. I'm not going to abuse much my position. I just want to come back to one issue, which is I think this is, as I said at the beginning, this is a great time for the European Union. Of course, it's a terrible tragedy for the past, but it's a great chance for the European Union to engage with European citizens. Now, the question is what impact all of that is going to have in European politics. And the reason why we decided to turn towards these webinars and to the podcasts that we are producing is that we wanted to work on the Conference on the Future of Europe. Of course, that sounds like if it was in the previous century, but this is probably much better a European debate than the one we would have had in this Conference on the Future of Europe. So now the question is probably one of the effects of this very particular moment for the public sphere that Hans-Jörg mentioned in his first intervention is that not only it is very negative, not only it is focused on one single issue, it also looks like it has completely removed all actors that are not national leaders from the European discussion. So probably one of the big questions we need to ask is how do we bring political parties, civil society, interest groups, the media, and into the quanti back into the discussion about the future of Europe. And this is probably one of the things we want to keep working on. Also, in the two roundtables and in the interview with Nadia, we have had not only a lot of food for thought, but also a lot of questions that require empirical investigation. So I think for those of us, that's also one of the opportunities of this crisis, right? That we are going to have data, we are going to have cases to look at what at some of the questions we have had in the back of our minds about European integration. I just left you a couple of more sources in the chat. The previous webinar, which is already in YouTube, in case you want to have a look at that. And a lot of the discussion is very timely after what we discussed today. And tomorrow we are having a podcast right on one of the things that Carolina discussed, which is, well, how political lines of conflict, how cleavages across Europe are going to be affected by this pandemic. So all that just to say, stay tuned. We can continue the discussion, not do everything tonight, and I'm sure there are going to be occasions to link up. So thanks a lot, Hans-Jörg, Caroline, Alexander, for being here. Thanks to the speakers in the first panel. Thank you, Nadia. And Jorge, do you want to say any closing words?
Well, no, indeed, everything is right. I just wanted to close this final conference with this jointly initiative by EUCOPOL and OpenEUdebate. So, as said before, is our last course, our last final conference, and we will keep posted with OpenEUdebate. Then in the following events, we are gonna organize through OpenEUdebate. Then. So thank you so much to everybody, to the students, to all the professors that have reached us, and all the speakers. And well, thank you for your moderation. Thank you to Nadia for being the special guest today, and well, to the speakers. Thank you so much, and I think we can finish here. Okay.
Thanks everyone, and see you online and the next events.
See you soon. Thank you.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.